Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's program at the Chicago Council. We are continuing an over 100-year history of bringing experts to Chicago to share their knowledge and their wisdom with our citizens, folks who are interested in creating a better world for their children and their grandchildren. And I want to thank the donors and the members who are here tonight and who are joining us from online for your support. It helps to make events like tonight possible. So thank you, and I hope you will all consider becoming members of the Chicago Council so that we can continue hopefully enriching your lives every way that we can. As many of you know, the Chicago Council is completely nonpartisan, and any of the opinions expressed tonight from myself or either of our two esteemed speakers will be our own opinions and not necessarily those of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Joining us in person tonight is Dr. Denise Dresser, a Mexican political analyst, columnist, and academic, among other things, currently co-teaching, I think you said, a course at Johns Hopkins University. She is also a columnist with the newspaper Reforma. She writes numerous works on Mexican politics and on U.S.-Mexico relations. And you may have seen her before as a TV commentator, both in the U.S. and the Canadian media. So welcome, Denise. We're very happy to have you here. And joining us remotely, she's currently in Mexico City, actually, is Lila Abed, the director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Lila was a White House correspondent for the international news channel NTN 24. She was previously a public policy advisor on Latin America for the law firm Covington and Burling, and has worked as the International Affairs Advisor for the Mexican Chamber of Deputies Foreign Relations Committee. So welcome long distance, and thank you for joining us from Mexico City. So we're going to start the evening with a conversation between myself and our two guests, and then there will be time for questions and answers at the end. If you are joining us from online, and I understand we may have as many as 500 people online tonight, you are welcome to submit questions at ccga.live. That's ccga.live for questions, and I believe you can also upvote questions that have already been asked that you would like to see offered. So without further ado, I'm going to throw out my first question. Denise is here. We're going to start with her and then move over to Lila. Apart from the obvious challenges that President Sheinbaum is now facing with the Trump administration, what are the biggest challenges facing the nation of Mexico right now?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I love Chicago. I was at a Mexican restaurant last night where I spent most of my time talking to people who work there, Mexicans who are understandably very upset about how the climate is changing against them in their churches, in their schools, on the streets. And I hope we can all empathize and support each other in these trying times. I'm Mexican. I've lived in Mexico most of my life. And I have never been as concerned regarding the future of my country as I am at this particular moment. I'd say the biggest challenge for Claudia Sheinbaum, and what you have read and what you know about her, is probably that she's a woman, she's a climate scientist, she's of the left. And I think the picture is much more complex than that. The biggest challenge she's facing is the very toxic legacy that her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, left to her. And I say this with some trepidation, having lived through the past 6 years of López Obrador, who was a very popular president and who had some significant accomplishments in his term that mostly had to do with poverty alleviation, lifting people out of the poverty, up from the poverty line, raising the minimum wage, focusing on a series of social programs that addressed Mexico's historic inequality. And all of this is to be applauded, given that we have been, historically, a deeply unequal and unfair country. But I'm not the kind of analyst who believes that the ends justify the means. And many of those ends were accomplished through the erosion of democratic norms, the destruction of democratic institutions, and the centralization of power in the figure of the presidency, taking Mexico back in many ways to a system of dominant party rule that existed under the PRI for over 70 years in the past, and that we had managed to transform gradually into a dysfunctional democracy, but an electoral democracy at the very least. Among the challenges she faces in the toxic legacy that López Obrador left to her are, for example, the reform of the judiciary. López Obrador wanted to recreate a system in which the ruling party, now Morena, has control of most of the institutions in order to effect what he called the fourth transformation. And as a result, and accompanied by a massive vote in her favor and the basic decimation, dismantling of the opposition, a well-deserved dismantling given how poorly the opposition had been in the last sexenio, as well as bad record in office, both the PRI and the PAN. What happened is that López Obrador was able to push constitutional limits, take advantage of a majority to rewrite the Constitution, change laws, demolish autonomous institutions, eviscerate checks and balances, and oftentimes with popular support, because people don't trust institutions, because they haven't worked for them in the past. They believe that change requires a strong hand. And this is a phenomenon that, as I'm speaking, I'm sure resonates with you, because you are now, when my friends and colleagues in the United States complain to me about what they are living through now or what they anticipate, I frequently say, welcome to my world. Welcome to the Mexicanization of Mexico, or the Latin Americanization of Mexico, or the United States finally joining the camp of countries that are experiencing democratic backsliding and an onslaught against liberalism and challenges to democratic rule from those who don't believe in it or are disillusioned with it. So this is what we've been facing in Mexico. And in order to fulfill many of López Obrador's requirements that were given to Claudia Sheinbaum by the outgoing president, he hand-selected her. She has gone ahead with, for example, reform to the judiciary. If you've been following Mexico closely, you now know that in June, Mexico will carry out a democratic experiment, which I believe more than anything is a power grab by the ruling party, whereby people will vote in an allegedly democratic election for all federal judges, all members of the Supreme Court, and all members of the Electoral Tribunal. So this, as I said, may sound very democratic, but in effect, if you look at how the election has been put together, it is essentially a way in which Morena can now control the judiciary. And why is this a problem beyond domestic politics? Because Mexico is facing very significant international challenges, especially vis-a-vis the Trump administration, and challenges related to structural issues such as the economy. López Obrador was very successful in terms of social programs, but not successful in terms of making the economy grow, in terms of attracting investment. And Mexico has had a historic opportunity of nearshoring, given what's happening geopolitically with China, an opportunity that was basically squandered over the past 6 years. And now we're in a difficult situation vis-a-vis Donald Trump, the threat of tariffs. And Mexico has the lowest growth it has encountered since, I think it was 1991. So imagine a judiciary system that people don't have any trust in, that believe will be highly discretionary, where the rule of law isn't applied in a fair or transparent manner. So this is not a good scenario in terms of Mexico positioning itself internationally. Second, the issue of the economy, very quickly. As I said, low growth, low investment, and massive deficit because of spending on social programs and so on. So she's in a, I'd say in a tight position vis-a-vis investors, companies that are evaluating whether or not we're a good place to invest in, and in the era of Trump, this is very complicated. And I started off with this because the news that you're getting out of Mexico is probably about drugs and thugs. And it's more complex. I'm sure Lila will address this. The challenges that I've posed are of Mexico's political economy. I hope that Lila now addresses what's going on with violence, with the territorial expansion of drug cartels, and the production of fentanyl, and why this has become such an issue in the bilateral relationship and an issue domestically for Mexico at a time in which the government doesn't have a lot of strength economically to, or even in terms of state capacity to deal with these fundamental challenges.
Interesting. Thank you. That was an excellent overview of the complexity of the situation. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. Lila, what are the challenges facing? I have to say Sheinbaum because that was my dad's name, so I'm not going to be able to say Sheinbaum. I'm sorry. But what some of the challenges facing the Mexican government?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and I apologize for not being able to be there in person. I'm a huge fan of Denise and, of course, of the Chicago Council, and I too love Chicago, but unfortunately had to be here in Mexico City to attend various meetings with Mexican officials. So, well, let me add a little bit of value. I mean, I think Denise covered, the big issues, the big challenges that Mexico's first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is currently facing. I totally agree with sort of the analysis of Mexico coming back to a dominant political party system, to a single party system, like Denise said, that we saw for 71 years under the PRI, that didn't really transition into a more democratic system until 2000. And we've been experimenting a transition of power, an alternation of power between different political parties as of 2000. But it is important to sort of understand why López Obrador, despite the shortcomings of his administration, has caused such a wave of enthusiasm within Mexico's, most popular sectors. If you look at sort of the voting trends of Mexico's recent and modern history, no single president had won over 50% of the popular vote since Ernesto Zedillo in the late 1990s. This is held true with Fox, with Calderon, with Enrique Peña Nieto. And it wasn't until Andrés Manuel López Obrador came into office that he actually acquired more than 50% of the popular vote. I think it is very telling that he not only came into power as a very, very liked and very popular leader, but he was also able to really talk to the poorest sectors of Mexico. I think his popular base just grew in allegiance to Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I mean, he concluded his 6-year term with over 70% of approval rates. And so I think that while we can also discuss some of the shortcomings and some of the challenges that Mexico faces and that Sheinbaum has inherited from López Obrador, there is something to be said about the revolution that he caused within Mexico's not only electoral system, but also the legacy that he left behind. Now, Claudia Sheinbaum, who is handpicked, like Denise mentioned, hand-selected by former President López Obrador, actually won by more than what López Obrador did in 2018. She won close to 60% of the popular vote. The Morena party, the current governing party, the one that was founded by López Obrador, acquired 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress, although there was a weird way that they attributed those majorities in both the lower and the upper house. They control 24 of Mexico's 32 states. And so they do have an overwhelming power and popularity within Mexico's political system. Now, there is Democratic backsliding. I mean, it's not an opinion. All the Democratic reports that have been published in recent months and years really, point to the fact that Mexico has very clear decline in various democratic indicators. Mexico, for example, according to the Pew Research Center, was a country with the largest growth in support for autocratic regimes between 2017 and 2023. I mean, specifically support for a system in which a strong leader can make decisions without the interference from parliament or the courts went up 23%. But it's also true, and it's simultaneously true, that the recent Latino Barometer report of 2024 reveals a historic fact, and that's that for the first time since 1995, at least half of Mexicans declare themselves satisfied with the functioning of the democracy in their country. And so I think that there is something to be said about what the indicators and the democratic decline that we're all discussing and that, international democratic reports are pointing to, but also the fact that a lot of Mexicans actually, consider themselves very satisfied with their political regime. Now, I will say that even though the opposition is sort of completely, it's alienated, it doesn't have a lot of power or relevance in Mexico's political system today. From an outsider looking into the Sheinbaum administration, one would say she has everything. She has control over everything. Denise certainly pointed to the fact that they have an overwhelming, power over the three branches of government. But I think that once you start to scratch the surface, you start to realize that the real challenge for Claudia Sheinbaum, at least in my opinion, and in speaking to many people here in Mexico, is that the opposition is actually coming from within the Morena party itself. One would look at her cabinet and say, she has a very strong cabinet of allies. And you quickly realize that she actually has very few real allies within her cabinet that actually respond to her, that are loyal to her. If you look at other members of her cabinet, including in the House of Deputies and in the Senate, and especially true with certain governors, many are still very loyal to López Obrador. They still respond to López Obrador's policies and reforms and his government of the fourth transformation. And so as Mexico's first female president, while she seems very powerful from the outside, she's actually having to deal with really deep structural challenges within her own government. And so when you say, the judicial reform that was approved under, López Obrador and that, Sheinbaum seems to have supported, and a lot of the constitutional reforms that are coming that have come during her short term, and a lot of the implementing legislation that is going to come out in the next couple of weeks, especially as it concerns the energy sector, is not necessarily what she actually would want to do. It's something that has been also imposed to her because she doesn't have full control over her government. And so I think there's something to be said about the internal dynamics of Mexico's current political system that I think is very telling for her current government. Now, I do think that in terms of some of the highlights, a light at the end of the tunnel, Denise sort of alluded to this. I think there are specs within Claudia Sheinbaum's government that do seem optimistic for Mexico's future, even though there is a continuance of a lot of AMLO's policies. As it relates to her security strategy, there is a clear deviation from her predecessor. She's much more focused on intelligence gathering, on interagency coordination, on targeting high criminals. Her security secretary, Omar Garcia Harfuch, has already presented clear results in the state of Sinaloa. He confiscated more than 1,000 tons of fentanyl, even though it's symbolic. It's a clear message to the U.S. and to U.S. security agencies and to the Trump administration that Mexico and Claudia Sheinbaum understands that today security, migration, and trade are interlinked and are interconnected. We no longer talk about trade, migration, or security in distinct buckets. They all now are interrelated. And so if Claudia Sheinbaum is able to produce immediate results on security, that might reduce the possibility of imposing tariffs on February 1st. If they're able to coordinate better and actually respond to some of Trump's migration demands, I think that could also prevent tariffs. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but I think a lot of them stem from the internal structures of Mexico's political system and within the governing party itself.
Well, okay, so thank you very much. I appreciate that. And as you both were speaking, I was thinking, how much of this kind of move toward authoritarianism among the populace is because they're just tired of the violence.
As I said, this is a global phenomenon. And I think there are many factors that are contributing to erosion throughout the globe. I'd say economic inequality is one of them, immigration and how countries deal with influx of migrants. In the case of Latin America, insecurity and wanting a strong hand. In the Latino Barometer poll that Lila mentioned, the other country in which the citizens are very, very happy with their democracy is Bukele in El Salvador. And no one, I think, would at this point suggest that El Salvador is a functional democracy. What is happening, I think, worldwide is that we're seeing a resignification of what democracy means for people. In traditional terms, democracy has meant, in historic terms, since Montesquieu, division of powers, transparency, accountability, separation of powers. And now, I think for many people, democracy is linked to results in terms of their living standards, in terms of making democracy work for them via concrete benefits that the government gives to them. And this is something that populist authoritarians of the left and of the right understand very well. And a way of gaining popularity is clearly by the politics of mano dura in security issues. And I'm sure what I'm saying here is also resonating for people in the United States.
So let's now move to a little deeper on Donald Trump's relationship with Mexico, and secondarily with Canada, but especially with Mexico. President Sheinbaum is a politician, right? If he places, and she said today she doesn't think there are going to be tariffs, by the way, but if we end up with 25% tariffs on Mexico, is she going to feel it necessary to respond in a forceful way to the U.S., or is she going to find some way to prevent what could be a catastrophe for the Mexican economy, I assume? Lila, let's go.
No, very quickly.
Yeah.
We're in a situation where, in order to predict the future of U.S.-Mexico relations and of the world, we have to understand what is happening inside one man's head.
Yeah.
And that, in and of itself, and I say this because that's how I spent the past 6 years trying to understand Mexican politics. And that, in and of itself, is very dangerous because it shows to what level democracy is not functioning in the way that one would expect in terms of issues of representation, of consensus building, of institutions working together to determine public policy, which is how you would expect public policy to be made on the basis of facts. Well, in authoritarian populist regimes, decisions are made on the basis of whim, on the basis of phobias, on the basis of political gamesmanship that is going to elicit support from your base. So I don't know if there are going to be tariffs. I don't know if Claudia Sheinbaum has privileged information that she hasn't shared with us, that she should, because she is allegedly the president of a democracy. But if Donald Trump decides to put tariffs on the Mexican economy, he's going to use it as a cudgel. As Lila was saying, these agendas are interrelated: immigration, trade, and security. And I don't think that she would be able to respond in a way saying, oh, well, if you put tariffs on us, we're going to put tariffs on you. That starts a trade war, and no one survives a trade war, least of all Mexico. I believe that Mexico, sadly, because of the imbalance in power, and we saw this in the last Mexican administration under López Obrador, Mexico made huge concessions. We became the Remain in Mexico place. We became the third safe country. We accepted hundreds of thousands of deportees. We accepted Title 42. And we had no other choice. And Claudia Sheinbaum, I think, will have no other choice, even though symbolically and in terms of political rhetoric or in terms of political narrative, in the morning press conference, she will continue to say that she is defending national sovereignty, even though that concept in this current day and age is hollow.
So we're going to go to you, Lila, but I think you've probably both read the great book, Boom Bust Exodus by Chad Broughton from the University of Chicago. And he made the point of how we all know that some of the food that we could buy in the store changed after the North American Free Trade Agreement came through. We could buy blackberries and they were really cheap, and avocados went down in price. But the Mexican diet changed substantially in that the makings for corn tortillas, for instance, suddenly came from the United States rather than being locally grown. And a lot of their other sources of food are coming from the U.S. now. So the question is, for you, Lila, what is at stake? What does Donald, well, that's a dangerous question. What do you wish Donald Trump understood about what is at stake for the United States if we push Mexico too hard, economically or on security, or also we should say remittance payments, right? I don't think that this is getting a lot of press, but the Mexicans who are in the United States send enormous amounts of money home to Mexico, just like the Filipinos who are in the United States send an enormous amount of money to the Philippines. It's one of the major sources of foreign currency for the Philippines. And if we start deporting the numbers of people who Donald Trump thinks he's going to be able to deport, this is going to have an economic impact on Mexico also. So Lila, what do you really wish that the people around Donald Trump could make him understand, or what are the risks to the U.S. at this point?
Yeah, so my internet is quite spotty, so please let me know if my internet is spotty. Let me backtrack a little bit. I mean, this is all about data, right? Mexico is the U.S.'s top trading partner. It positioned itself at so in 2023 with two-way trade totaling just shy of $800 billion. We're talking about a region, North America, that is working under a new regulatory and legal framework known as the USMCA that came into force on July 1st, 2020. Since coming into force, investment has increased by 136%. The trade of services and goods between all three countries has increased by 50%. The regional supply chains are completely interconnected, interdependent. And so any imposition of a tariff on Canada, on Mexico, is going to completely have an impact on the US, on Mexico, and on Canada alike. We are facing a 2026 USMCA review, which according to many analysts and according to sort of the political climate that we're currently in, it all seems like it's not going to be extended for 16 more years, but rather we're going to fall into a situation where we're going to have annual reviews, which will reduce the certainty and possibly impact negatively the potential investment that could flow into North America in a moment where the U.S. and the region itself is competing and trying to counter China. Now, how are the tariffs going to actually impact on a practical basis? I think there are three scenarios. The first scenario is that there are no tariffs placed on Mexico. There's not a 25% blanket tariff placed on all Mexican imports into the United States. Under that scenario, things sort of continue as we currently have them, and hopefully avoid an economic trade war and also an economic steep decline for all three countries. If the United States decides to place a 25% blanket tariff on Mexican imports, Mexico is going to retaliate in kind, right? So it will impose a 25% tariff on all U.S. imports into Mexico. Now, how is this going to affect the United States and Mexico? You know, it's very likely that there, depending on the supply chains that you see, but let's take the automotive sector as an example. The auto sector, certain parts cross the border 5 or 6, 7 times before they're actually assembled into a vehicle. And so imagine imposing a 25% tariff every time that auto part crosses the US-Mexico border. It ultimately is going to impact US consumers because now their vehicles are going to be substantially more expensive. If you place a tariff as well on the technology or the manufacturing sector, it's going to have a domino effect that ultimately the U.S. consumer is going to have to pay for it. And in a moment where President Trump is trying to reduce inflation and try to lower the cost of products, I think that this is going to be significantly difficult for him in the near term. Now, there does exist a third scenario where President Trump decides to only impose certain tariffs on selected products coming from Mexico, especially those that are very traditionally Mexican, like beer, like tequila, like avocados, like tomatoes, right? That are ultimately going to hurt Mexico and have very deep economic consequences for Mexico and also for U.S. consumers. That, you know, the Super Bowl is coming up. Everybody likes their guacamole and everybody likes their chips. And that's going to maybe not be possible if avocados are facing a 25% tariff. But if they decide to only impose a tariff on selected products, let's say from 5 to 10%, perhaps 7%, then Mexico could also select certain products that are they're imported from the United States. And that's not to say that those products or the products that aren't facing tariffs couldn't face tariffs in the near future. In the next 6 months, for example, the list of products that are facing tariffs could be switched around. Some could be eliminated, some could be plugged in. But ultimately, this is going to hurt not only the United States, it's going to hurt Mexico, and it's going to hurt North America. And only by having North America with really strong regional supply chains can you actually compete or have a chance of competing with China. And I think that's why in recent weeks, we've heard from the Mexican government under their Mexico plan, that they are trying to reduce the imports into Mexico from Asia, particularly China, because one of the biggest issues, one of the hottest topics on the bilateral agenda is what Mexico is going to do with the increasing influence, presence, and investment of Chinese products coming into Mexico that are serving, according to Washington, both Democrats and Republicans alike align on this, is that China's using Mexico as a backdoor. And so I think all of these issues will come into play, especially ahead of the USMCA review. And nonetheless, I think in any scenario where tariffs are placed and linked to migration and linked to fentanyl, even if they're set in place for a week, 2 weeks, hopefully not a month or longer than that, is going to be detrimental for Mexico, for the United States, and especially so for Canada if it also faces similar tariffs.
So I think my concern, and this is, I'm a little more familiar with Canada because I served there when I was in the Foreign Service. It's going to hurt, frankly, especially the trade with Canada, because we get so much wheat and canola oil, vegetable oil from Canada. So, I mean, it's going to affect people in ways that the sanctions with China did not affect people, because it's going to affect food prices. But we are still an extremely wealthy country. Canada is still an extremely wealthy country. We still have institutions that I think are going to get through whatever this weird period is that we're going through right now. They may be damaged, but we'll get through this. I'm deeply concerned about the stability of Mexico, the ability to, continue with their ongoing security frustrations. They are not blessed with the neighbors that we are blessed with. They have their own crises in Central America that they're dealing with. What is the risk? I mean, what is kind of the national security risk to the United States if we push Mexico too hard on some of these things, and you start to see genuine hunger more widespread than it already occurs in Mexico?
It's interesting. I was listening to Lila speak, and I agree with every word she said. It's a perfectly rational argument. The thing is, I don't anticipate much rationality coming out of the White House these days, because I think policy is based on different kinds of impulses and on different kinds of strategies that have to do more with personal popularity or with vengeance or with eliciting support and maintaining the mobilization of a very angry base that can channel its anger towards the other, towards the immigrant, towards Mexico, towards fentanyl production. Because if this were a rational game, President Trump would not threaten tariffs, knowing that this would lead to inflation, that this would hurt his own base in terms of their capacity to consume a series of goods whose price would elevate. However, I think that if we don't see tariffs imposed on February 1st, it's because Mexico is going to make concessions, as it has in the past, precisely because Claudia Sheinbaum knows that the stakes for Mexico are way too high. And what does President Trump want? He basically wants, and he's gotten this over the years, for Mexico to militarize its border. He got this out of the López Obrador administration when Secretary of Foreign Affairs Marcelo Ebrard went to Washington, and Trump said, I want 30,000 troops on the border. And I think Marcelo Ebrard offered 50,000, and off they went. And Trump wants Mexico to stop caravans, and Trump wants Mexico to take back deportees, and Trump wants Mexico to accept all of those who are asking for asylum, even though asylum has essentially ceased to exist in the United States. And he wants U.S.-Mexico collaboration on fentanyl production. And remember that this collaboration ceased under López Obrador for a series of complex reasons that have to do with the Salvador Cienfuegos case. Remember the Mexican general who was apprehended in Los Angeles and charged with collaborating with cartels, then sent back to Mexico. And at that moment, López Obrador said, oh, you arrested one of my generals, DEA officials are no longer allowed in Mexico, et cetera. And so collaboration stopped. And I believe that President Trump wants collaboration to be renewed and on American terms. And he is also penalizing Mexico for what I believe was a failed policy of López Obrador, which was, as you know, abrazos, no balazos, which meant hugs, not bullets. And his position vis-a-vis organized crime and cartels was, let's leave them alone as long as they don't hurt civilians, and let's establish a kind of informal pact with the largest cartels and try to reach deals so as to reduce violence. But in order to justify that policy move, he said, we need to militarize Mexico to face security concerns. So one thing I did not underscore in my portrait of democratic erosion in Mexico was the deep militarization of Mexico's political system and of its economy. The military is now in charge of airports, of aduanas, immigration, like the key levers of the economy. But
wasn't that because she and her predecessor trusted them more than the police in terms of corruption?
Well, that always was the argument. But what functional democracy do you know gives such key aspects of its economy to the military? But regardless, the military, yes, became a huge force in terms of economic and political decisions, but its main task, paradoxically, has not been to go after organized crime. Its main task over the past 6 years was actually capturing migrants. And so we're going to see much more of that occurring, I'd say, in the near future, because and I think it's very important to understand, tariffs are being used for political reasons. They're being used to bring about certain kinds of security and collaboration accords that would have been unthinkable in the past in terms of Mexico accepting them. And President Trump, as we saw with Colombia, is willing to use tariffs as a political tool. We saw this with Petro over the weekend and how the Colombian president ultimately caved in very quickly because the United States can withstand tariffs. But Latin American countries, especially Mexico, where 80% of our exports go to the U.S. market, I think it's a very effective ploy on the part of President Trump. It's devastating for our country.
I mean, that is the risk. Let me ask you, Lila, this is a question we have. We have a question from one of our viewers about how the June judiciary vote is structured generally. And but even beyond that, how can you have a functioning judiciary if they are afraid? I mean, this is one of the biggest goals of we don't have aid programs as of today anymore, but we used to have a really good aid program in many countries in the world where we were teaching police departments how to keep their judges safe, because the judges would only convict terrorists and drug dealers and those kinds of folks if they knew their families weren't going to be assassinated. They wanted to do their jobs, but their families weren't safe. And so the U.S. Marshals would go in and provide guidance and assistance and teach the police departments how to keep judges safe. So will these judges be safe? I think I've read articles about the prosecutors being targets from some of the organized crime. So it's really a two-part question for Lila. One is, how is this judiciary vote structured? And we've heard that the ruling party will probably win, I guess, most of the judgeships. But secondly, what is the security situation for the judges in the first place?
Well, yeah, I mean, let me try to answer this as succinct as possible. I mean, the judicial reform really represents a complete overhaul of Mexico's judiciary, right? In speaking with some of the people that support the judicial reform, they say that Mexico's judicial system, as it was before this reform, had a lot of shortcomings. And while that is true, there are certain reforms that could actually deepen a lot of the challenges with Mexico's judiciary. I think I'll point out three things, right? Some of the challenges that we're going to see sort of in this process of electing judges at all levels, right, from the lower courts up to the Supreme Court. We're talking about more than 7,000 local and federal judges that will now be elected by popular vote. The first tandem of tranche of judges will be elected in June of this year. Of course, that will include the Supreme Court judges. I think the selection process itself is very alarming because if you do have control of the governing party, despite the contrary views that the Morena party could have internally, ultimately they're selecting candidates, right, that are aligned to the governing party's ideology. And if you stack the court with people that are aligned to the government, I think that obviously can have very deep ramifications for Mexico's judicial system going forward. But perhaps
so I understand the candidates were selected by the ruling party. How were the candidates selected?
So they were selected in different. Yeah, Denise. Yeah. You can go, Denise. You can go ahead, and I'll.
Just very quickly. The executive proposed hundreds of candidates. Yeah. The legislative power proposed hundreds of candidates.
And they're both in the same party.
The judiciary proposed a certain number of candidates. The executive and the legislative branches are controlled by the ruling party. Their candidates are going to be those that represent or aligned with with the ruling party. The judiciary is a discredited part of the government because the president spent 6 years lambasting the judiciary because it was the one guardrail that said, Mr. President, you cannot do this. This is unconstitutional. This goes against the law. Over the past 2 weeks, you've lived this in the United States with judges saying, Mr. President, this is unconstitutional. Well, after being stopped over and over again by judges in Mexico, López Obrador turned against the justice system. So the day of the election, who's going to go out and vote for hundreds of these people that no one knows? They don't really know where they come from. There's going to be a lottery system. So it's essentially the political control of the judiciary carried out under the nominal guise of a democratic election.
Okay.
Lila, I think it's important to, I think it's also important to note, I mean, it opens the way, the path, right, for organized crime to be more involved in these kinds of elections. They were already involved in local elections, especially as it concerned the police chief or a local judge. But now you really open up the path for them to be involved up to Supreme Court judges' election. And so I think that that's a huge, warning for Mexico's judiciary, but also for many investors in the United States and abroad that come to Mexico and, depend also on the legal framework and on a very clear set of rules in order to be able to protecting their investments. Now, there is one part to the judicial reform, and Denise, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that I think doesn't receive as much attention as it should, and it's the creation of the Court of Judicial Discipline, right? So this new court could rule not just on the judicial misconduct of judges, but it could also open investigation into judges for their legal reasoning. Right. And so this new body is going to consist of 5 members that are going to be elected by popular vote. But let me just set up practical scenarios so that we get a better understanding of what this will look like on the ground. So let's say you have a U.S. investor in Mexico.
Really, we do have to go to the audience. So if you could go, if you can tie this up in 2 seconds, and then we're going to take questions.
I mean, ultimately, the Court of Judicial Discipline is going to be able to remove any judge that, does something against the government's policies or, draws a conclusion that hurts the government itself in detriment of the investor. And so there is no legal certainty for investors in Mexico. And I think for a president that's talking about attracting billions of dollars of investment in the next years, I think if there's no judicial certainty, if there are no clear rules, and if you don't have that capacity to make sure that the rulings are fair and just, I think that's going to stem a lot of the investment we could see in the near future to Mexico.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So just to remind you, if you are too shy to put your hand up, you're welcome to add a question if you're here in person, to add a question at ccga.live. And for those of you watching online, please feel free to ask a question at ccga.live. And I'm having a little trouble seeing, but I see one hand way in the back there, so we'll start.
You talked a lot about sounds like you talked a lot about corruption. Do any of you see it getting any worse? And when would you say it might get better? Thank you.
Excellent question.
Corruption in the United States or in Mexico?
We're discussing Mexico, but this will be a very interesting discussion on the United States at some point. Yeah.
Aside from being an analyst, I've been an activist for many years, and I was involved in a very long process in the Peña Nieto sexenio to try and create an anti-corruption system at the national level. It was a very complex undertaking that involved many members of civil society, long negotiations with the government. We managed to create something. And when López Obrador came in, he scrapped it and said, this is of no use. Corruption is going to be swept from the top down. It'll depend on the president being honest, and everyone else will be honest. And if you look at the indicators, you'll see that in every major international index, the World Justice Project, Transparency International, et cetera, Mexico has fallen in terms of perceptions of corruption. Why? Because in order to combat corruption, it's not just it's not just the president being honest. He said, I will sweep corruption from the top down. Well, you need a broom. And Mexico has been eviscerating the few institutions that it had created to combat corruption. And what we're seeing is the renewal or the strengthening of crony capitalism. This is a term that I hope you get used to. You'll be using it a lot. What has happened? You've seen people who are close to the ruling party get contracts. You are seeing the top oligarchs of Mexico, like Carlos Slim, doubling or tripling their fortunes. You are seeing many backroom deals that do not go through the norms of a public, transparent administrative process that we fought for many years. Among the things that was eliminated recently was the National Transparency Institute, the National Competition Commission, created precisely to bring about something that Mexico has never had, which is, functional markets and a level playing field and transparency for investors. Without a competition commission, what happens? Decisions are made in the National Palace, or in your case, they will be made in the White House. And all of this has implications for citizen rights and consumer rights, and for the good functioning of an economy that requires competition, innovation, and regulation. One of the things I'm worried about that is happening in tandem in both countries is the scrapping of regulation, which is one of the ways of combating corruption. So I see cronyism on the rise in Mexico, very sadly.
I saw sir, right there in the second row. Well, could you stand, please, and just make sure, please, we're running out of time, so if you could make sure your question is succinct and ends with a question mark.
To what extent is the violence in Mexico having a negative effect on attracting investors to the Mexican economy?
Oh, that's a huge question. And not only that, attracting investors, but also attracting investors who can get insurance. Because when there is a U.S. government travel warning on a country, I don't know if you know this, most insurance companies will not insure the company in that country. So,
I think Lila should answer.
Yeah,
this
Lila,
question.
why don't go ahead, please? Could you talk to us about how that
I'll
is?
try to be very short in answering this. I think it impacts tremendously, right? Investment in Mexico. I think we've heard from the current government that they've increased their investment substantially in the last years, but when you really look at the numbers, it's actually reinvestment more than greenfield investments. And so I think that's telling of the fact that the investment, and despite the nearshoring phenomenon that we've seen for a variety of geopolitical reasons, Mexico hasn't established the right conditions to attract that investment. One of those is the high levels of insecurity that are now hopefully going to be reduced by the new security plan that Claudia Sheinbaum has unveiled. But we're 4 or 5 months into her government, so we're just barely seeing what that's actually going to look like. But if Mexico has insecurity problems, it doesn't have a workforce in order to be integrated into sophisticated industries, if there's not sufficient energy, if there's not access to water, if you don't have the infrastructure necessary, there won't be investment, despite the fact that you have USMCA, despite the fact that it's North America and that you're competing with with other trading blocs around the world. You need to be able to establish the right conditions to attract that investment. It's not just going to flow to Mexico naturally because it's geographically close to the United States. Investors do need to get a return on their investment. And I think insecurity is definitely one of those really important aspects that prevents investment to continue to flow into Mexico.
Let me channel some of the people around Donald Trump now, and I think a lot of Americans. We've poured enormous amounts of foreign aid into Mexico for the last 50 years. The military has worked closely with the military there, trying to train a better military. We've tried to train the law enforcement. I mean, it's not that we haven't done anything. We've been trying. And yet you have just described a system that does not seem able to fix itself. So what should we do? If what we have been doing hasn't worked, what should we have done? I mean, what is the argument for continuing to try?
The argument for continuing to try is that, especially now, you want a functional North America. If you perceive that the threat is China, instead of parceling out responsibilities and finger pointing to different countries, it's the time to think about, effective supply chains, about nearshoring, about re-engineering and deepening North American collaboration on security, on trade, on immigration, versus this silo thinking that pits countries that are part of North America against each other. And I think it's important for the United States to understand that some of its problems are of its own making. I mean, if you point fingers at us in terms of fentanyl, I would like to remind you about OxyContin and the epidemic created here by Purdue and
the theory of supply and demand.
No,
in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we would not have a supply problem if you did not have a demand problem.
That's right.
I think it's
true.
No, it's very
100%
important,
true.
and also that while you're underscoring just how horrible Mexico is, look at growth in the United States, look at prosperity in the United States, and a lot of that has to do with the USMCA. It has to do with integrated supply chains. It has to do with Mexican labor in this country, which makes many sectors of the economy work and provide prosperity and low prices for all of you. So I think that the vision needs to be turned on its head, not how do we blame Mexico for problems of its own making or that we created. It's how do we as a region confront what is happening in the world, whereby we can use this as an opportunity and not play it out as a blame game against our neighbors that in many ways make our own lives possible.
Thank you. Sir, right there in the turtleneck. Oh, yeah, if you could wait for Mike. And
I just wanted to follow up on your question because I'm not sure you got an answer. So forget the U.S. Let's look at Mexico. Let's look at Canada. The comment was the security situation, the violence, the cartels, diminishes investment in Mexico. Do we say the same thing about Canada? And I guess I'm kind of asking, you have two neighbors to your north and south. One seems kind of troubled. The other one has issues, as we all do in the world, but they're not the same issues. Why haven't there been improvements in Mexico more along the lines that we see in Canada?
what's holding Mexico back among our three nations? Is that one sentence? Okay, close enough.
But how much time do you have? I mean, I teach a course on contemporary Mexican
Let's
politics.
do this. Let's give you 1 minute and let's give Lila 1 minute to answer that question. What's holding Mexico back from prospering the way that Canada and the U.S. are prospering?
I'd say two things, and I can delve into them in a subsequent conversation. One is cronyism, and the other is absence of rule of law. If you look at any of the books by Acemoglu, Robinson, recent Nobel Prize winners, they have long chapters on Mexico. And some of these problems have to do with exclusionary economic systems and exclusionary institutional systems. actually have thought deeply about how to address these issues, and I think there are solutions, but they're all related ultimately to good governance, and that's what's been lacking.
Lila.
Yeah. I mean, I just don't think that you can really compare Canada to Mexico. I think the realities that Mexico deals with on a daily basis are completely different, particularly in terms of security, right? The cartels have completely taken over 30% of Mexico's territory. Why has that failed? Because of a lack of clear policies, right? And I think that has been affected by a lack of rule of law, by a lack of by an increasing amount of corruption, which I agree completely with Denise in terms of how it's deepened under the AMLO administration, but it's by no means new to Mexico, right? It is part of the social fabric, part of the glue that keeps the Mexican machine going. And as much as I hate to say it, this is also part of the culture of Mexico. You really have to sort of strip Mexico from the very, normal sort of task that you do when you get stopped by a policeman. Instead of grabbing a ticket, you give them 20 pesos or 100 pesos. It's part of the culture. And so it's linked to insecurity, but it's also linked to cultural issues. It's linked to structural deficiencies in Mexico's political system. And I agree with Denise that it is part of having a government that doesn't respond correctly to the people. It's about police training, and it's about police honoring the police, right? Because the police themselves are not paid enough. And so they ultimately end, joining or taking money from the cartels. And so there's a lot of issues. There's structural issues, horizontal and vertical issues that have prevented Mexico from really taking strides forward. That said, I don't think it's all bad. I do think that Mexico has been able to accomplish real achievements in the past when it does collaborate with U.S. security agencies. I think when it gets really bad and when we get to moments like these, for the reasons that Denise and others have mentioned, is when there's a deterioration, a complete deterioration of mutual trust between U.S. and Mexico security agencies, when both countries decide that their priorities are going to be met by unilateral actions and not by mutual collaboration. That's when you really start to see a disintegration of security objectives, of shared security objectives, and therefore both countries end up losing. And so hopefully that'll be reignited, and hopefully mutual trust can be revamped under the Sheinbaum and Trump administration, not only because of fentanyl, but also from illicit arms trafficking that's flowing from the United States to Mexico. And so if you don't see it as a mutual challenge, if you don't see it as a mutual solution, then you really end up losing. Both countries end up losing. And that's why I think the United States needs to continue investing in Mexico. And that's why I think Mexico needs to continue collaborating with the United States, despite any ideological, thoughts or projects or transformations that Mexico may be, dealing with currently.
So I'm going to put both of you on the spot for the last question. Give you each 45 seconds to say this. As citizen diplomats, everyone in this room, what can we do to reassure Mexico, to reassure our Mexican neighbors here, to reassure Mexico, and perhaps even to move this relationship forward somehow, regardless of what happens in Washington for the next 4 years?
Vote
Give us some hope.
So let me kick it off really quick so Denise can close. I think the narrative needs to change. I think in a moment where disinformation tends to take over facts and reality, I think there needs to be an awareness campaign of what Mexico means to the United States and what the United States means to Mexico. I don't think that a lot of U.S. citizens know that Mexico is the U.S.'s top trading partner. I don't think a lot of people know that Mexico is the U.S.'s top agricultural destination. I don't think that a lot of people know that more than 1 million American citizens live in Mexico, and more than 11% of its population in the United States is Mexican. And this is not undocumented migration. This is just the fact that they're from Mexican heritage. But a lot of the basic goods that are consumed in the United States, from avocado to tomatoes to beer to tequila to mezcal to vehicles, everything depends on the U.S. and Mexico working in tandem, working closer together. Security challenges need to be addressed mutually by joint objectives. And so I do think that there needs to be more of an awareness of the reality of what the U.S.-Mexico means for both countries. More than 1 million crossings every single day, more than $1 million of trade every single minute. There is nothing that compares to the US-Mexico relationship. There is no other relationship in the world that impacts more lives on both sides of the border like the US-Mexico relationship does. And so I think when we start to understand that this goes beyond just trade, migration, and security, that it really deals to cultural and geographical proximity. We are neighbors. We are in a marriage that can't face divorce, for better or for worse. And so the way that we address mutual issues and the way that we discuss the narrative between both countries, I think is so needed in a moment where we don't really understand that importance.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So go home and talk to your friends and neighbors about Mexico. Can you give us 2 sentences to close?
I completely agree. I think that this country has been whipped into a frenzy about hatred of the other, about hatred of immigrants, about hatred particularly of Latinos, and how they represent a threat, that they're criminals, that they're rapists, that they're taking over, the cultural underpinnings of American identity. And for those of you who have friends, colleagues, ties to Mexico, and who understand the reality of interconnection and the reality of a North American identity that was constructed in a painstaking manner since the first NAFTA agreement of 1994, we are in reality North Americans. I have 3 children. They have a Canadian, an American, and a Mexican passport. They are a true sign of North American integration, and I've taught them to love and appreciate what there is of each one of these countries. And I hope that you take these thoughts with you and spread them. I think that's the only way in which we can counteract what are political objectives and what are political wars that seek to divide us instead of unite us. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and maybe you can make some new friends tonight. So enjoy the rest of your evenings.